be generous. I would like to.
Thank you for coming today. I want to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land we're meeting on, the Kaurna people, and pay my respects to their elders past and present. We convene today for the second hearing of the inquiry into price gouging and unfair pricing practices, chaired by Professor Alan Fells. I'm Dale Beasley, the SA Union Secretary, and I'll chair today's inquiry, focused on the experience of South Australians. Today we have the privilege of hearing from the South Australian Council of Social Services, the Zara Foundation, a distinguished expert in markets and law, alongside invaluable testimonials from members of our community. Their insights will undoubtedly shed light on the multifaceted dimensions of price gouging and its real-world implications. The stories of Matthew and Chantel, individuals who have shared their dire struggles with the inquiry already in affording basic groceries and making ends meet, resonate with many of the submissions this inquiry has received. Their stories epitomise the broader societal challenge that we are here to address. The supermarket sector has been the subject of hundreds of submissions, bringing to fore the concerns around market dominance and its potential to sway price unfairly. But it's much broader than that. In 2022, South Australians saw their wages go backwards by 5.5%. In the same year, they were slugged with almost a dozen consecutive interest rate rises. And we're the insecure work capital of the nation and have the highest rate of people forced to hold down multiple jobs to make ends meet. Added to that, the enormous price rises that this inquiry is examining in food and groceries, energy, insurance, fuel, accommodation, and airlines, in particular, the stark profits displayed by companies like IAG and Origin Energy underline the urgency of this inquiry. Today in Adelaide, like all the hearings from Melbourne, and when we're heading next to Cairns, Sydney and Canberra, we aim to foster a robust dialogue, collect substantive evidence and work towards actionable recommendations. An interim report will crystallise our findings by the year's end, pinpointing areas necessitating deeper investigation. We expect the report to look at the themes raised by this inquiry and propose policy solutions for a more competitive and fairer market. I'm looking forward to today, and thanks to those of you who've shared your time to come and make contributions. I want to start by welcoming Dr. Mark Giancarsbro. Thank you for joining us. Thank you. I'll invite you to make some opening remarks and then might pose a few questions from there. What's yours?
Thank you so much, and thank you for inviting me to give a submission on this topic. I think it's extremely important and it's excellent. It's getting the attention it deserves. I should start by just acknowledging that my background is in consumer protection and commercial law more broadly, as a practitioner and as an academic as well. I think we would all remember the rather dire situation in which our nation found itself from 2019 onwards for a plethora of reasons. But there were two incidents in particular which I think are quite relevant to this inquiry because it demonstrated the occasionally unsavoury nature of humankind. But during the Black Summer bushfires, as they were branded by former Prime Minister Scott Morrison in 2019 and 20, we saw millions of hectares destroyed, 7,000 odd buildings, 3,000 homes, 33 deaths, and 1 billion animals, you heard that right, met their sad demise. But during that time, it was quite shocking to me personally to see the price of staples such as loaves of bread triple, and bottled water, I think, doubled and in some cases trebled as well. And then, of course, during the COVID-19 pandemic, certainly during its initial phase and through the onset throughout 2019 through to 2020, and even now to some extent, we saw again the prices for basic goods and services, essential goods and services for which demand is inelastic, just skyrocket. I think the primary instances in which we see price gouging rear its head do seem to arise throughout crisis periods, and that's where my research is primarily focused. So I think we are all familiar, of course, with the general concept of price gouging, and perhaps one point of divergence with my research is that price gouging, of course, the name carries very negative connotations. However, I think it can, in some instances, be justified where, for example, there are extreme supply costs brought about by shifts in the market and inability to reach, in particular, remote locations. So I think we're all familiar with that. I think in terms of the Australian legal framework, and this is where a lot of my research is focused, much more needs to be done. Price gouging, as I think we're all familiar in this room, is not illegal in Australia. One exception, of course, at the federal level is through the Biosecurity Act, in which case the Federal Health Minister can make a determination with respect to sanitary goods. That, of course, was a bit of a knee-jerk reaction, if you like, during COVID, during the height of COVID, I should say. There are some assorted exceptions, of course, as well at state level through state legislation, but the instances in which those exceptions can be enlivened are quite limited. So at the moment, I think it's unique in that Australia finds itself in a position where, in order to address price gouging, it's having to rely upon a series of existing protections which are not strictly designed to address price gouging. And therein lies the problem. So what we're finding is that wherever instances of price gouging are addressed formally, and I have to say that is, at least in my experience as a practitioner, quite irregular and uncommon, having to rely upon a series of existing provisions addressing tangential concepts such as unconscionable conduct, misleading and deceptive conduct or deceptive conduct. There's also avenues, of course, to pursue it indirectly through the Competition and Consumer Act itself. So, for example, you could regard price gouging behaviour as anti-competitive, as substantially rather lessening competition, etc. My personal position is that that is not adequate. These protections, these provisions do, of course, protect consumers, but indirectly, and they address behaviours, again, which do not necessarily pick up price gouging. Now, I fully acknowledge that the courts and the regulators, and especially the governments as well, are not there to set prices for the market. And I agree that would result, of course, in some significant disruptions. But I think we are talking about something different. Depending, of course, on the model that's adopted, if a model is adopted for sort of a remedy in this area, if you like, or some sort of framework to address it, it really will depend upon a variety of factors, one of which, of course, is what shape, does that particular framework look like? My research has shown that the bulk of the price gouging statutes and regulations that exist across the world typically come in three forms. So you've got, of course, your price freezes, you've got your capped price increases, and you've got limits on price increases, which are generally measured by normative standards such as unconscionable or excessive increases. So at the moment, I think it's some 36 out of the 50 United States, so US states, use a combination of these methods. The New York model has been the one which has primarily been the basis for other models throughout the US and elsewhere. You've also got Canada, France, South Africa. A lot of these jurisdictions do actually see merit in outright either outlawing or in other ways controlling instances of price gouging or the conditions which give rise to it. Other jurisdictions are a little bit different. The United Kingdom is a good example where I think you see more indirect methods to try and address price gouging. So I see us more aligned to jurisdictions such as the UK. What's interesting for me as a scholar as well as a lawyer who very much believes in the merit of as full-hearted consumer protection laws is, and I believe this has been publicly stated, but the ACCC's position appears to have been in the past that it's sufficient to sort of throw all of our eggs in the basket of an unfair trading practices provision, and that this will sort of do the trick. And this is, of course, with all due respect to the ACCC, but I'm not convinced that's true. Treasury, as I'm sure everyone is aware here, is currently, of course, consulting on this and released that white paper, if you like, discussion paper, looking at various models for consumer protection amendments, there were 4 models proposed, one of which was a bit of a hybrid model where we have a fixed prohibition coupled with what is colloquially referred to as a blacklist of exceptions, which are essentially examples of these behaviours. Now, I looked at that list and didn't notice price gouging there at all. And I thought that was interesting. If we are going to rely upon this proposed new model, and of course that is subject to input from the community, assuming it is worded even closely to that, I would have expected that price gouging would be listed as a behaviour. And of course, in some of the foreign examples that are cited in that report, it is mentioned. So I think there are a couple of issues there in terms of the black hole that exists with regulation. And for me, that is a serious problem because we've already seen it. We've seen price gouging throughout the pandemic, throughout the other various economic and environmental disasters which have occurred. We are seeing it. It's still happening. My research has, as I say, primarily focused on crisis periods, but I think, to be honest, it goes well beyond even my research. I think price gouging happens in everyday staples, which we've already seen, of course, in the media reports around, or certainly questions around things like petrol prices and basic food products. And again, price increases are attributed to all manner of things from, international conflicts through to supply chain issues. Obviously, there are a variety of moral and economic arguments that go both ways there. I'll certainly acknowledge, as I did earlier, the economic arguments against wholesale regulation, or at least more fierce direct regulation and targeting this behaviour. But frankly, the market has been trusted long enough. And if it's at the point now where this is still happening, then I think this is where we can fully justify doing something about it. We've done this before. The Competition and Consumer Act and the Australian Consumer Law were amended quite heavily, and the Trade Practices Act 1974, of course, was for the many reasons, but especially because it lacked certain protections which were required, was replaced. So we have done this before. And again, can we trust the market? Now, not everyone, of course, is bad. Not every retailer or vendor is out to exploit. Sometimes it's unavoidable. There are supply costs. The supply chain has been drastically disrupted. And as a result, there's been a domino effect. I fully appreciate that. But there are instances where people are clearly getting away with this, with price gouging, where there is no such justification, where those margins are dramatically higher than what they should be. And I think they are the people that are doing the damage, and the broader economic impacts of that need to be addressed. And frankly, the only way I genuinely and personally believe that can happen is through regulation. Again, I am very wary of, and this is of course something the economists will corner with, disrupting the market too significantly, too severely. So whatever approach is adopted, if any approach is adopted, should be quite measured. And that means having input from, let's say, both camps. And I don't want to draw a false dichotomy, but obviously the economists will be up in arms about what I'm saying right now, and I understand that. And in fact, I can appreciate a lot of their concerns. And I don't think it's also appropriate to go the complete opposite direction and run the moral line. If we take the moral high ground, frankly, no economy would survive. We live in a very capitalist and structured economy. We have to accept that. And so I think it's completely unreasonable to simply say it's unfair. It's only unfair where there's no reasonable justification, or where the market itself, through its own natural forces, cannot justify those movements. So I think my personal position, as I've said, and I'm perfectly happy to go on record and say this, is that if we were to have some sort of legal framework addressing price gouging, it should either do so directly if it's intended to, or indirectly if it's intended to do that. However, I think we should be very cautious in making sure that, for example, if we adopt a model whereby we have example behaviours, price gouging is expressly mentioned. I don't think existing protections will adequately pick up price gouging. And to use some of those earlier examples, proving unconscionable conduct is difficult enough. And I mean, as a lawyer in this space, I can tell you our courts are grappling with that concept. It's very loose. It's based on moral and normative factors, which are difficult to apply. And again, the courts have said on numerous occasions, we are not here to control or regulate the markets. We are not here to set prices. So they've effectively disclaimed any responsibility for doing so. And again, I say that with respect. So I think we just need to be very careful to ensure whatever options we do take, if there are any options to be pursued, that they specifically address this practice.
Thank you, Dr. Jing. Jean Carsborough. I do have a couple of questions, and I want to go back to some of the comments you made at the start and then throw out your opening. It's about the prevalence of price gouging during national emergencies, which you have written about,
Yes.
and the social harm that causes. I've got two questions on this matter. First, what are the factors that lead to price gouging in these circumstances? And then the second is, I think your research has indicated that this type of practice is generally short-lived.
Yes.
Whereas we aren't seeing a short-lived spike right now, and wondering about your reflections on why things might be different. So firstly, what are the factors that lead to price gouging in those circumstances?
Thank you. Both very good questions. The first one is, I suppose, a little tricky to answer because there are a myriad factors that would contribute to the conditions which give rise to price gouging. However, for me, and certainly through my research, there are a couple that do sort of shine more brightly. First of all, of course, is issues with reaching the point of equilibrium whereby we have sufficient supply to meet the demand that there is. The problem with certain types of goods, particularly during crisis periods, is that demand, of course, skyrockets, and beyond ordinary heightened demand, which can occur in spikes. For example, things can become popular just through natural forces, social media, etc. But during crisis periods, those goods, the demand is typically inelastic. So things like sanitary products and basic food staples and whatnot. That's one problem or one contributing factor. Another is that they're actually harder to source. So unlike some other goods, for example, general consumables, they're produced en masse and they're not, again, typically the subject of increased demand of this scale. But during a crisis scenario, your basic staples and whatnot are impacted more heavily because, for example, production factories which produce general staple foods, for example, will either hold production or drastically be reduced. Compare that to facilities which produce non-essential goods, and it's not quite as severe. I think a third factor is probably we've been able to meet demand up until, I suppose more recent crises have sort of demonstrated where we have to sort of acknowledge our inability to meet demands. And I think there's a confluence of factors there, but for me, it's the variety of circumstances. So, for example, we've had not only a pandemic, we've had severe environmental disasters, bushfires, floods, etc., throughout and across Australia and the world. We have now international conflicts. We have a very delicate economy, global and domestic, which is artificially, I'll say, inflating cost of living. And so I think all of these factors are leading to disruptions in the supply chain, which otherwise would ordinarily be shouldered. But I think at the moment we simply can't because there is too much. There are simply too many disruptions. So I think it's a combination and a really volatile one of all of these factors. But I think that is traditionally, for me anyway, where you would see certainly increased demand for a lot of these goods. But again, price gouging can also simply be the product of malicious retailers who simply seek to generate higher profits. I think they're certainly the rarity. But yeah, I think it would be a combination of those things. So social, environmental, economic factors, the nature of the goods, and the capacity to create those goods.
Considering all of that, then, what do you think are the biggest barriers at the moment to being able to effectively tackle price gouging? Is it lack of, you talked about the regulatory space before. Is it will? What do you think?
Again, I think it is a combination of things. I wish I could put my finger on one and say, here it is. But the first one that jumps out is, as you said, something I did mention, which is we have a patchwork of protections within our competition and consumer law framework. And I am focusing primarily there. That is my area of expertise. I'm sure there are other statutes and regulations which have a say as well in trying to control market forces. But I think there is certainly nothing that I can see that would directly be able currently, as the law stands, to be able to address price gouging. So that's certainly a barrier. Another barrier is capacity to enforce such a provision. The regulators, of course, are I don't want to use the word under-resourced, but they are certainly subscribed to the maximum. So they have to be, of course, very selective with enforcement actions. That obviously leads to strategic decisions about, do we go for low-hanging fruit, or do we try and pursue what we know is happening out there in the deepest, darkest corners of the country, but which we simply cannot reach. I think that is a serious problem. And again, everyone will always cry and say we need more money. But I do actually think the regulators need the capacity to be able to enforce these provisions. Otherwise, discussions like this are frankly rendered futile. And again, I say that with respect. I think there are probably a couple of other barriers which I might call sociocultural barriers, I suppose. One is, of course, some people frankly oppose the idea of any kind of imposition on the free market. And again, I'll come back to the economic camp. That is exactly where they will land. Part of me agrees with them. Part of me says, you know what, that is basic economics. If you interfere too much, we become far too overregulated and the state becomes too involved with the market. And then we end up with the converse problem, which is that there is no freedom in that market. And that, of course, impacts on consumer choice. It's self-defeating. So I think that is a barrier as well. And of course, again, we have to ensure that there's reasonable prospects of being able to detect and prosecute, and I'm using the word prosecute there, but certainly to enforce actions against wrongdoers. There's enormous issues of proof. And speaking solely as a lawyer, I can see real difficulty in being able to establish that this actually is price gouging, as opposed to simply trying to accommodate extreme supply costs, which are driven by all sorts of factors we've discussed. That is a barrier as well. So I think they are probably the biggest ones that I can think of. I'm sure there are more.
Right. Three of that list of 4 issues preventing action could probably be resolved through, some pretty direct action, the resourcing of the regulator, the patchwork of regulation and stitching that up, and action against wrongdoers. What do you do about an ideology that is against addressing price gouging?
That is a very good question. And again, that ideology will be multifaceted. Primarily, it will be driven along economic lines. Of course, there is a moralistic argument which runs this way too, which is why should a supplier shoulder the cost of extreme supply costs, when those costs have become extreme and unseen. I suppose I would say we cannot obviously bow purely to social attitudes when we are legislating. I mean, it will never please everyone. In the ideal utilitarian model of legislation, we would be able to do just that. But I think if most people, when I say most, but the reasonable and rational member of society, and certainly the rational consumer, would see that this is for the greater good, this is for them, because we are simply trying to avoid instances of gross exploitation, which is the essence of price gouging. I did mention before it can be justified because, again, gouging it obviously carries negative connotation, but it's the idea of perception. We're talking about the perception that prices that are being charged are unfair, unreasonable, or just completely out of the ordinary, and that we're not trying to offset supply costs. We're instead trying to exploit the consumer. Well, that's the behavior we're targeting, and I think that has to be the line. So part of the sell to the consumer market is this is for you. And the way we do that, of course, is going to be informed by your input, but also obviously input from various experts. And, here we are sat having this discussion right now. I think it's fantastic. We have to have the discussion, though. It will be difficult. And again, there will be opponents. But frankly, for me, I can certainly see the argument against it, but I can't see the almost lesser harm, if you like, being outmuscled by the greater harm of doing nothing.
Indeed. Look, I'll give you the opportunity to make any closing remarks or any other comments that you want to make. Otherwise, I thank you for your time.
Of course. No, I'd just like to say again, commendations for having this inquiry and asking these questions, because I don't think they get asked enough. And whatever comes of it, again, I just applaud the efforts. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for your time. We are a couple of minutes away from our next guests joining us, so we'll just take a brief recess. Thank you.
Thanks.
Wyra, Senior Policy Officer. Yeah, I'd like to welcome Dr. Rebecca Toa,
That's right.
and Malvina. Malvina, of course it is. From the South Australian Council of Social Service. Dr. Tua is Director of Policy and Advocacy, and Malvina is the Senior Policy Officer for the South Australian Council of Social Services. My name is Dale Beasley. I'm the Secretary of SA Unions, chairing today, and I would invite you to make some opening remarks, and then I have a few questions as well.
Thanks, Dale.
The floor's yours.
Great. So the South Australian Council of Social Service is the peak representative body for non-government, not-for-profit health and community services in South Australia. And we have a vision for justice, opportunity and shared wealth for all South Australians. Our purpose is to influence public policy in a way that promotes fair and just access to the goods and services required to live a decent life. And we undertake policy and advocacy work in areas that specifically affect low-income consumers in South Australia experiencing disadvantage. We have a long-standing interest in the delivery and affordability of essential services, and our research and advocacy highlight that the cost of basic necessities like water, electricity and housing impact greatly and disproportionately on people on low incomes experiencing disadvantage. And that's what we'd like to focus on today. We know that we're in the midst of a cost of living crisis, but the impacts are not distributed equally. Often those with the least are paying the most for everyday essentials, with fewer options for relieving the pressure themselves. So our evidence today will largely focus on energy and housing prices, although those are the areas where we're seeing the greatest stress being placed on households. So first I'd like to talk about energy prices. The CPI data released yesterday reinforces a pretty poor picture for South Australia. In the last quarter, CPI for electricity in South Australia has gone up by 15.3%. And while this is a significant increase, it has been tempered, according to the ABS, by the energy relief package, which we understand would leave it at over 22% if that wasn't there. So this is still, though, a significantly different picture than the one we're seeing at a national level, where in the last quarter electricity increased by only 4.2% with the energy relief package factored in. Although when you exclude that, it was at 18.6. So we're going to be doing some further unpacking of this CPI data over the coming weeks, but we wanted to highlight these figures as an indicator of the significant and increasing pressure households are under when it comes to energy bills. Back in 2018, the ACCC argued the energy market and retail competition were failing consumers, and we see little evidence that it's improved since then. And in fact, we would argue that it's actually deteriorating. The default market offer that's provided is not protecting consumers with a genuinely fair default. And in fact, it wasn't designed to. So people are being burdened with unreasonable wholesale and retail costs for electricity and energy that don't reflect the efficient cost of providing those services. And many people are on contracts that are higher than that standard offer, which means that they have to continuously renegotiate or switch their contracts just to avoid paying unreasonable prices. And we know that for people that are experiencing hardship or language barriers or perhaps domestic violence, that constant switching is not a feasible way to manage electricity prices. In fact, having to constantly switch retailers and monitor offers isn't sustainable or appropriate as an expectation for any consumers in terms of accessing an essential service. We shouldn't be penalising people with higher energy bills for not constantly engaging with a complicated energy market that they increasingly can't trust. So the regulations and consumer protections framework is failing to protect consumers and is in need of reform. And that's evidenced by the increasing number of people on energy hardship programs or in energy debt, as well as the constantly increasing prices. So in South Australia, we have the second most unaffordable energy behind Tasmania, despite having among the lowest average household electricity usage in the nation. In 2021-22, electricity was more unaffordable in the previous year. We don't have the current year data yet. And low-income consumers are spending 5% of those disposable income on electricity, compared to around 2% for average income consumers. For households that are in hardship, it's around 8%, so it's even more unaffordable. We've seen a nearly 24% increase in 6 months in the number of customers that are paying an energy debt from 22,000 up to over 27,000. We have the largest average residential energy debt in the national energy market. It's now at 1,200, so it's over $200 above the national average. And the number of customers in hardship has also increased from pre-pandemic levels. The average debt of a hardship customer is now $2,500, the highest in the nation, overtaking Tasmania, and an increase of over $600 from 2018-19 and $600 above the national average. So a really significantly worse picture here. And when we have a look at what's driving up the costs, we see that a lot of the costs in South Australia are associated with network-generated supernormal profits. And they are adding up to around $1,200 per customer over 8 years. We're seeing that energy bills, the largest increase is actually a result of those direct network supernormal profits. In 2023, over 30% of the retail bill are suggested to be a result of supernormal profits. I should emphasise that this is research from the Institute for Energy Economics and Financial Analysis, not SACOS research. So what it means is that while a retail bill would increase in the coming year, would be significant, for South Australian households, it would only increase by 15.6 compared to 22.5. So there would be a real saving if there wasn't supernormal profits. And this is not a recent phenomenon. This is something that has been occurring since 2014. So we're seeing across the national electricity market, profits are on average 1.7 times the allowed profits under the regulatory scheme, with total revenues exceeding total cost by nearly 11%. So the problem here is that people cannot choose to go without electricity. But energy companies can choose how much they charge. So there's a real power imbalance between consumers and providers. And the standard advice to shop around just doesn't cut it anymore. People are running out of their options and the measures to insulate themselves from skyrocketing prices, particularly people on low incomes. And it can't be viewed as reasonable or acceptable for people to have to continuously shop around in order to avoid paying excessive prices. There's just too many other demands on people's time, especially people on low incomes. The other area we'd like to highlight is around the increasing rental costs that are placing a significant strain on households. And this has been an area we've been focused on with a great deal of concern for quite some time now. It's vital because housing is a fundamental human need. It accounts for the largest expenditure of most Australian households. On average, over 18% of household expenditure is housing. For those on low incomes who don't own their own home, rental payments constitute not just the largest single household expenditure, but the one that can impact on their quality of life and ability to pay for all their other goods and services. You simply can't avoid paying for housing costs unless you want to risk being evicted or potentially made homeless. And invariably, that means people will have no choice but to sacrifice other household needs. So, for example, choosing not to buy medicine or not to pay for food in order to keep a roof over their head. In Adelaide, more than half of all renters were in the bottom 2 income quintiles, and around a third of those are in rental stress, so spending more than 30% of their income on their rent. And we're seeing rents increase in every quarter, and that's been a consistent pattern since 2020 in the recent times. The CPI for rent increases in Adelaide had gone up by 4.9% at December 2022. And the average increase for new rentals in the metropolitan area had gone up by 14%. In the latest CPI data, we've seen that rents have gone up by 7.1% over the year to September last year, and by 1.7% in the quarter. That's well above the general inflation rate of 5.4%. And it's the largest annual increase since December of 1990. So we're seeing that the impact of inflation now in that similar way to those experiences of the 1980s and into the 90s. So that's meaning a renter in an average house is now paying at least $35 a week more than they would have been a year ago. And when you add that up over the year, it becomes significant. We've been calling for rents to be capped at the national CPI, and that would significantly, meaningfully reduce that increase down to 527. So it would still be an increase, but at a more manageable rate. And of course, in a cost of living crisis, every dollar counts. We also know it's not a problem unique to the metro area, and we're seeing unaffordable rents across regional South Australia as well. A single parent with 2 kids that are reliant on a job seeker payment would need to spend more than 40% of their income for a 3-bedroom house in all regional South Australia. There's no area where that wouldn't be the case, with a high of 63% in the Adelaide Hills region. We know that a single person wanting to rent a 2-bedroom unit would need to spend 32% of the minimum wage, 43% of the age pension, or over 60% of job seeker. So it's unsustainable for people to try and do that. There are lots of reasons why rents have been increasing so rapidly, including high interest rates and lack of supply. But one of the things we've seen is chronic underinvestment in public and community housing in South Australia. We're also concerned about the loss of long-term rental stock into the short stay rental market, particularly in the regional areas. We're hearing frequently that that's a problem, particularly where there's high tourist locations, and it is having a major knock-on impacts on the amount of housing available for workers and community members. So SACOS has proposed a vacancy tax on properties without permanent tenants, and we're really interested to look at the initiatives of the Victorian government around short stay accommodation. Finally, I'd just like to say a little bit about food prices. They haven't been a focus of SACOS work, but we're certainly hearing from our members and our sector that the impact of rising food costs is really having a significant stress, adding significant stress to the people that we care about. The latest Food Bank Hunger report showed 3.7 million households experiencing moderate to severe food insecurity over the last year. And in South Australia, there's been a drop in the number of households that are food secure from 71 down to 65%, so a 6-point decrease. And the majority of these households are not talking only about food, but also about energy and housing cost increase as the reasons why they can't afford food. And for 77% who were food insecure in the last year, this is the first time. So we're seeing a shifting profile. Households that are experiencing food insecurity are, for the first time, more likely to be young, employed, and with higher annual gross household incomes than we've seen before. And this is happening in the context of the big supermarkets expanding their profit margins, and more so than some of their international counterparts. Once again, food is a necessity and a major household cost. And it's really troubling to hear people going hungry in a rich nation like Australia while companies are growing their profits. Although the companies have stated the increases in profits are due to productivity gains. Over the past year, food prices have gone up by nearly 5% nationally, but over 5% in South Australia. And even where they've gone down, so we have seen a reduction in the cost of fruit and vegetables, it's been smaller in South Australia than the rest of the country. And prior to the September quarter, food prices were increasing at a rate above inflation, so adding to the pressure. So this is one of the reasons why we're hearing of these food insecurity statistics and the number of households ending up needing to use food relief services just to get by. I'll leave it there. We welcome questions.
Thank you. Thank you for those opening remarks. The lived experience of renters has been a focus of SACOS's advocacy recently, but also, over a long period of time. Can you talk us through the pressures that renters are facing? And I'm talking specifically about impacts like whether people are curtailing their energy use and what that means for people's well-being and quality of life.
Yeah, absolutely. So we're certainly hearing that people are doing that. Renters are facing a kind of a dual crisis of lack of availability and lack of affordability. So that leaves renters with no choice sometimes but to suck up the rental increases or face homelessness because there's nowhere else for them to choose to rent that might be cheaper. So we are hearing frequently that renters are making impossible choices between paying the rent or paying for medicine, or not even turning the heating on right through a cold winter, or if they can afford it at all, turning it on in one room. We've certainly heard stories from some of the renters we've spoken to, taking the light globe from one room to the next to minimise the costs of the rent of the energy use that they're facing. And one of the things we've been calling for is simple retrofits to make rental homes more energy efficient to help renters be able to manage their costs, because they cannot control the amount of heating or cooling that a house needs. Mm-hmm. We know from some work we did earlier this year that has knock-on effects for people's health across a whole range of psychological, mental and physical health outcomes. So we heard from renters who are ending up presenting at the emergency department 10 times in a year with exacerbation of their asthma because their house is cold and mouldy and they can't afford to make it dry and warm. We know in summer that people suffer really significantly from heat-related problems and heat stress because they can't cool their homes, particularly during heat waves when it will stay hot right through the night and the house just simply won't cool down. And it has both short-term but also long-term impacts on the kinds of health outcomes. And we undertook some research which showed really significant differences between the health outcomes and health service utilisation of renters compared to people that are homeowners in South Australia. I don't know, Malvina, whether you wanted to say any more about the work you've been doing with the Rental Coalition.
Yeah, there's significant evidence, not just in Australia, but in other countries as well, who have actually worked to tackle some of this problem around the significant impact that improving the energy efficiency of homes has, both on the energy bill savings for rental households, but also improvements to their general health and well-being. I think a lot of the time when people, particularly when they hear about uncomfortable, like homes being thermally uncomfortable, so like either too hot or too cold, they think it's a mild discomfort, but it's actually where we're talking about homes that exist for the majority of the time with people in them that are outside of the healthy temperature as identified by the World Health Organization. And that's really concerning because that leads to a lot of negative health outcomes. And actually in South Australia in particular, it leads to a disproportionate number of deaths, particularly in the winter months. It's also one of the ways that SACOS regularly advocates we can meaningfully reduce a lot of that energy bill pressure, particularly in the long term. It's one of the ways that you can tackle some of that significant energy debt that we're seeing in South Australia, because it helps break the cycle, because people at the end of the day, for the most part, have kind of rationed their energy use as far as they possibly can already, to the point where it's actually harming them. Expecting them to do more is not realistic and not reasonable. So you have to find a different way to actually make it affordable for them to use the energy that they need, and that would be healthy for them. And so you can do some of that through concessions, but realistically, to actually have that meaningful and lasting impact, what you have to do is you have to make their homes livable. So we've done some research this year together in partnership with Renew, who did some modelling for us, that showed that even kind of in terms of heating and cooling, small changes like changing from a gas heater to an even inefficient electric heater can save hundreds of dollars per year for a family. So that kind of helps break the cycle. And you can actually make that even more effective with some small changes, such as draft ceiling and installing blinds and all that sort of stuff, or moving to a more efficient electric reverse cycle air conditioner, where you can actually then introduce cooling over summer as well and still save hundreds of dollars while having that added benefit of thermal comfort both in winter and in summer. So we kind of see this as an opportunity to have a big impact in multiple areas of people's lives.
Yeah. Okay. We have heard evidence in this inquiry proposing a more robust regulatory framework federally, but thinking about the areas of food security and housing that we've just been talking about, there's conceivably a role for the state government as well as the federal government. What are SACOS's views about how the state could intervene to address the issues that you've mentioned? And I know you've mentioned a couple already, but
yeah. So as I mentioned, we've been calling for a rental cap, which would help to address the immediate affordability crisis, or at least do something that might put a bit of a break on those increasing prices. But we've also been working and advocating for a range of reforms to renters' rights. So the state government is reviewing the Rental Tenancies Act at the moment, and we've been calling for improvements to particularly end no-cause evictions. We're looking for mandatory energy efficiency requirements in rental houses, and also for those energy performance of houses to be disclosed, so renters can make choices when there are any available about less or more energy efficient homes when they're making those decisions. We're also seeking, as part of a coalition of not-for-profit and consumer groups, to allow renters to have pets. So we're recognising housing as a human right, and renters having and enjoying the same rights to housing as everybody has.
Yeah, in terms of housing, also the vacancy tax would make a big difference in our view, in ensuring, because as much as we talk about there being a lack of housing, it's actually a lack of available housing. There's plenty of empty properties out there that are being underutilised. And so we view a vacancy tax as a bit of a way to free up some of that space and get people into homes who desperately need them.
Okay.
And we have also been calling for a reinvestment and rebuilding of the public housing estate. So we've lost thousands of public homes in the last few decades, and we're now looking at needing 1,000 new public houses a year just to begin to address that. And we know that if there were more public houses available, people on the lowest incomes wouldn't be forced to use the private rental market, and we would expect that that would then place downward pressure on rental increases, as well as freeing up availability and allowing people who are experiencing the highest levels of vulnerability to have the most secure housing available to them.
I think also in terms of what state governments can do outside of helping to advocate for some of that national reform, and that's something that SACOS definitely wants to see in the energy space. We have long been calling for having percentage-based energy concessions so that they actually reflect the real costs that households are incurring. They're currently deeply insufficient, and particularly reviewing the Emergency Electricity Payment Scheme, or EAPS, in South Australia. As currently, it's incredibly difficult to access and can only be accessed once every 3 years, and it's a couple of $100, which when you look at kind of the magnitude of bills people are currently facing, it's kind of a bit of a drop in the ocean. And similarly, we've also been advocating for providing a lot more supports for particularly low-income households and particularly renters as well to access energy efficiency retrofits, even minor ones. Again, because we know that research from the Brotherhood of St. Lawrence and the University of Melbourne shows that upfront cost barrier is the main barrier they face to kind of being able to help themselves in that regard.
I have one more question. The recent work that SACOS has done in regional South Australia, what did you learn about the experience of people in the regions compared to the experience of people in more urban areas?
Yeah, so we've been doing, I suppose, a bit of a listening tour of regional South Australia around a couple of projects this year, one focused on digital inclusion, but we were interested more broadly in what's happening in the regions. And we've certainly been hearing all of the same pressures that we've talked about today regarding cost of living. Housing is a very large pressure, and not just for renters, but the lack of available housing across the board in regional South Australia is creating huge pressures on the workforce. So there's workforce shortages caused by the lack of housing, because some of the workers that need to be able to provide services can't afford to live, or can not even afford, they can't even find somewhere to rent in the short term or to buy in the long term that's affordable. So that then has impacts not just on social and community services, but more broadly on the economic sort of flourishing of our regional areas. And so those things then compound some of the other challenges that people in the regions are facing around access to healthcare and other services, where there's a much greater reliance on travel to access a lot of the services that we know people need. In the digital inclusion space, what we've been hearing is that the closure of face-to-face services in country towns, so banks, telcos, but also government services, so Medicare services, SSA, those kinds of hubs, has forced people in regions very much to use all of the online services. But across the regions, we see concentrations of people who don't have the same digital access or ability to use those services, who are being completely, essentially excluded from some of the things that they really need. And a lot of that, the effort to help them is falling onto our libraries and community centres, who are not being adequately funded to provide this new service, really, for communities that no longer have face-to-face services available to them. So those changes have happened without consideration of people's ability to actually be able to engage online in the way that people in the city, or people that are very digitally included, imagine everybody probably experiences.
That's very good points. That is it for my questions. I'll give you an opportunity to make any closing remarks that you might want to.
Well, look, I think really the cost of living crisis is acute and is being borne most particularly by people on low incomes. it's not the same as I can't have, the 5 coffees a week that I like to pop out of work to have. We are talking about people who are making impossible choices that have short and long-term impacts on their health and well-being. And it's not right that that should be happening and coming at the expense of people, massive profits across various industries at the expense of people's, health and well-being.
I think for us, it just highlights the juxtaposition when you see, particularly in the areas where people are most struggling, for us, energy in particular, you see some of the profits that are being reported in one breath from these companies, while in the same breath they're telling their customers that their retail offer might go up by 55% because of costs that they've incurred. So it just doesn't add up for us, and it's kind of a bit of a hard pill to swallow, and of course even harder to afford for everyone else.
All right. Well, thank you again for coming in and for giving us your time. Our next guest is not with us yet, so we'll just break for a short moment. Thank you.
Thanks.
All right, thank you, everybody. I want to welcome David Craig, who's joined us here, a local community member, here to talk about the issues that price gouging bring about in your personal life. I'm going to give you an opportunity to make some opening remarks, and then I may have a few questions for you. So please, the floor is yours.
Okay. Yeah, basically I'm a pensioner. COVID put paid to sort of, the last job. So that means I've got to rely on the Commonwealth pension. since then, of course, my rent's gone up 14% in the last 2 years, which is pretty tough when it's almost 50% of your pension to begin with. And then, of course, this so-called inflationary spiral. I mean, so some of it, yes, I'll agree with, or well, I'll not agree with, but I will acknowledge is the way it is. But there have been a few things which look a little bit suspect and certainly perhaps need looking into. I mean, the obvious characters are sort of, the banks, but the banks have always done that since they were deregulated back in the 70s. It's been eliminate competition by buying up smaller banks, not passing on interest increases to depositors, and so being so fast to increase mortgages and loans and stuff that it's not funny. And they only need a couple of weeks or a couple of months with that extra differential to make some incredible money. Having worked in the banks, I know what they get up to. The gas, probably the one that irks most is gas. Well, gas affects the cost of electricity, which has gone up markedly. But it's Australian gas. Why should we be paying international prices for gas? There was talk some time ago of a windfall tax, which seems to have just disappeared because of the gas companies got more clout than anyone else. So that's one that annoys me. And then the supermarkets got in on the game, so blaming logistics, which I think for the most part is garbage, because the products I noticed were Australian products, Australian grown or Australian made or whatever. And really, after 6 months after COVID hit, so the transport industry was more or less back to normal. Admittedly, there may be a few small issues, but certainly not sort of statewide. Couple of perfect examples is for about 2 months, you couldn't get a frozen chip anywhere in any of the supermarkets. They just disappeared, except for the high price brands, who for some reason seem to have still been able to supply, even though that's sort of, the cheaper brands and the sort of home brands have disappeared, and they were not available for at least 2 months. When they did eventually come back, they were $1.50 a kilo dearer. And fresh eggs was the other one that sort of stood out. So for a month or two, so there was virtually no eggs available, except for your organically grown $6-7 a dozen varieties. And it took quite a while for them to start coming back on. But really, I don't think the chooks stopped laying. I think there's been a bit of sort of shenanigans going on in the back, in the back door. In the back doors of the supermarkets. Don't order it; it becomes unavailable. You can then put the price up, and eggs have gone up $1.50 odd a dozen too. So create a shortage, charge more. And they're the main ones that I've seen personally, apart from sort of the fact that sort of it affects me on a personal basis by making me somewhat more isolated, but I can't afford to go anywhere. I think twice before I get in the car. Haircuts are sort of basically put on, like deferred for a week or two, so to spread the cost a little bit. Things like sort of the odd takeaway dinner, forget it. So it's just a matter of sort of buying the cheapest I can get and surviving day to day. I think that's my bit.
I want to say, a very sincere thank you for sharing your story with us. We've heard from a lot of academics and experts during this inquiry, but it's the personal stories about how price gouging and the cost of living crisis is impacting people that are, well, one, they're what we're here to talk about, right? But they are also, I think, the most key at helping us understand how people are impacted, but then what needs to happen to fix it. Something we've heard a bit about today, and this also goes to the announcements about inflation figures yesterday, is the cost of energy. You did mention, feeling isolated as a result of not being able to jump in your car. Are there any other impacts on you around the cost of energy, like gas or electricity?
Well, electricity, of course, I've always been fairly careful with it, but I make sure that everything's turned off at night at the power point. I don't have any more than one light on in the house at any one time, and basically don't use high energy appliances. There is an air conditioner in the place I'm in, but I'd rather put a jumper on than run it in winter. And summer, it gets a bit hot too, I have to use it, but it's basically just cutting right back on as much as possible.
Having lost your job during COVID, we have heard that was, a particular spike in the unavailability of a lot of goods and products, and that led to a period of price gouging there. But we have seen, very, very high prices sustained since then. Is there anything else that you want to share with us about your experiences over the last couple of years?
Not really, because I was actually past the retirement age. When I was working part-time. It didn't affect me as badly as if I'd been in the 55 to 65 age groups and have to go back onto New Start. So at least I went on to full pension. So I was lucky that way, and I've been able to survive reasonably well. But it's getting tougher.
Indeed.
Yeah, definitely particularly in the last 6 to 12 months.
Is there anything in the last 6 to 12 months in particular that's gotten a lot worse?
Well, basically just a sort of general cost of everything, and two rent rises doesn't help.
Yeah. Something that we want to do with this inquiry is, hear from members of the community like yourself about how the current situation is impacting you, but then ultimately get to a situation where we can make some recommendations and give advice to government and policymakers about how we could make things better. Is there anything that you want to say about what action the government could take to make things better?
Well, I think your gas and electricity people, the banks really should be looked at. And so I think re-regulating them in some ways, or a people's bank would be a much better idea than the way it's been going, because really for the last 40 years or so, they've been, ripping the public off. When I was working in the banks originally, the differential between a house loan and what you were paid as a depositor was you get 3 3/4% on your money as a depositor, and your house loan at most was 5.5%. So 2% difference between the two, and now it's what, 5 times that. Although admittedly, a mortgage rate's a lot better than what I was paying when you had 16% at one stage. But yeah, the differential has grown. I mean, you get virtually nothing on what you deposit with them, and they're charging 5.5%, 6% on a mortgage. So the banks have got to be looked at. They're reducing competition, which is and now they're starting to close branches and things. So it's just not, they're not playing ball. The gas and electricity producers have got to be looked at, gas in particular, because they're making a killing by charging us export rates. And supermarkets, well, how are they getting record profits in a high inflation cycle? It means there's something not quite right there either. Maybe the main ones that I've seen.
Yeah. All right, unless there are any closing statements that you want to make.
Not really. Just it's sort of, yeah, it's pretty tough. It's tough out there, and I'm probably a little bit better off than a lot. Yeah, at least I've got a car. There's no way I could survive with public transport and get out here.
I again want to say thank you for having the courage to share your personal experiences with us, and thank you for joining us.
No, thank you.
Thank you. We now have a break until our next guest, who's due to arrive at 4:45.
Thank you. Yeah.
Well, yeah. Welcome back to the inquiry into price gouging and unfair pricing practices. I'm now joined by Kellyanne Tansley, CEO of the Zara Foundation, to give expert testimony. Thank you for joining us. I'll give you an opportunity to make some opening remarks, and then I've got a few follow-up questions as well. So over to you.
Thank you for the opportunity to be here today. So my name's Kellyanne Tansley. I'm the CEO of the Zara Foundation Australia, based here in South Australia. It's excellent to be here today and share the experiences of women who are connecting with our services. So we provide financial counselling services and adult education to women who have been impacted by domestic and family violence. And we've seen over the last 12 months significant mental health and overwhelmed women connecting with our service due to the increase of essential goods and services.
Are you able to take us through the work of the Zara Foundation and in particular, what's happened to the work that you do and the services that you provide in that recent period of time that you just mentioned?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'll probably start with some data now. So when I looked at the data last financial year compared to the financial year prior, our financial counselling service administrates grants for women who are in hardship or need emergency relief. And I can see that we've had a 66% increase in grants being administered over the last financial year. And we've got more and more women connecting with our service who cannot afford basic goods like food, clothes, shoes for the children, access to education for kids because of the rising cost of living.
Yeah. Are there any of those factors that are presenting with more prominence than others?
I think I'll probably share with you a case study if that's okay.
Yeah, absolutely.
So when I was talking to my team about coming here today, one of the staff members said just last week they were working with a woman who we'll call Jill for today to protect her identity. Now, Jill previously worked for South Australian government and she's got 5 children. She was in a relationship which was characterised by coercive control. The abuse increased to the level where Jill realised she needed to leave the home with her children. Because she owned a property and that was caught up in family settlement, she had to access private rentals and she had to leave her job at SA government due to health issues. Currently at the moment, her rental, private rental costs is 70% of her income. And because of the rising cost of living, she's relying on food bank and emergency services simply just to feed the children. Jill was in the office this week, Dale, and she was sharing with our caseworkers that she has got a chronic health condition and she can no longer afford the prescription for the medication she's needed. Unfortunately, Jill's story is not unique. Particularly over the last 18 months, we see a massive impact on women who had experienced domestic violence coming out of COVID, where a lot of women had lost work. And now it's being compounded by the rising costs of living. So we've had women this week alone in the office crying over the cost of butter. And the mental health in terms of being so overwhelmed, they're in survival mode. They're not knowing how they're going to pay the rent next week, how they're going to put fuel in the car to get the kids to school, how they're going to feed the children, worried that they're going to end up homeless, that there's no access to social housing, and not being able to get access to mental health services as well. So quite a complex situation.
Absolutely. How does the financial counselling and education that you provide, how's it had to change or adapt given that there are now just so many things that are more expensive?
Yeah, look, that's a really good question. So our financial counsellors are spending a lot of time dealing with creditors, telcos, utility providers, trying to negotiate access into hardship policies and have debts waived. I was able to pull some more data, which shows last financial year we had a 74% rise in debts being waived. Previously, women would come in and seek support around managing money, and the financial counsellors were able to talk to them about ways they could save for emergency situations or for special occasions such as Christmas or birthdays or purchasing school uniforms. And the financial counsellors at Zara are telling me now that the budget is so tight, women aren't being able to afford rent, food and electricity. There's no opportunity to save for the rainy day or worse still, an emergency. And a lot of the clients we're supporting, you know, they're one or two incidences of often just misfortune, you know, the car breaks down or there needs to be repairs on the house, which can just push them straight into extreme poverty and for some women into homelessness.
Obviously, the women that seek the assistance of the Zara Foundation are, as you've described, facing really, really difficult and challenging circumstances. I can't help but to think that with the exponential increase in what you've described and the changes that the Foundation's own staff have had to go through to adapt and continue to provide services, that there may be an increased level of vicarious trauma that the Foundation's own staff are exposed to. Is there anything you can tell us about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So when I spoke to my team about this inquiry and coming here today, and more broadly when we're talking to the team about the work and what's happening in terms of the complexity of cases, the staff are seeking more assistance in terms of training around how to deal with people with mental health and themselves reporting it's having an impact, seeing women walk in. And often, you know, we work to empower women and give them hope. And sitting in circumstances where it seems impossible, regardless of, you know, maybe we waive a debt, maybe we offer a grant for assistance, but still we know that there doesn't seem to be any future where this is going to get easier for them. So that has an impact on the workforce where they see their job is empowering women and feeling that sense of hopelessness or where they're unable to do that because of the current circumstances. I think something else which is really impacting on our staff is there's a lot of women who feel now that they've got no opportunity but to return back to the perpetrator of violence and abuse. And as staff are talking to women, of course, you know, we talk about safety first. It's important that you're safe. It's important that the children are safe. And our clients are saying back to us, but we're going to be living in our car. We're going to be on the streets. I can't afford to feed my children. What else am I going to do? I need to return. We've got a lot of clients who are separated but still living under the same roof for that same situation. And that makes our work quite complicated because we're safety planning to make sure she and the children is safe. Yet there isn't pathways for them to be able to move out of the home because fear of poverty and homelessness again.
Absolutely. That seems like a really impossible situation for people to be in. It does sound like from the evidence that you've given and testimony we've heard from others who've appeared that there's, you know, amongst those who are impacted most severely by cost of living and the cost of living crisis, they rely quite heavily on civil society and the community sector. And in that way, it sounds like, you know, our community writ large is very reliant, and the system is very reliant on the work of the community sector. What would happen to the women that turn to the Zara Foundation for assistance if your foundation was too overwhelmed to be able to provide the support?
Look, it is a challenge we're facing. At the moment, I've got 120 women trying to get access to our education program, 5-week waiting for financial counselling service. holding that with risk of worker burnout and vicarious trauma. So we need to protect our workforce and not overwhelm them, but they're acutely aware of the wait lists. So I think without community services, undoubtedly more women would be sleeping in cars. We know in those situations, often child protection services are going to step in and children are going to be removed. We know that compounding trauma in those situations. So I think community services are absolutely essential at this point in time. We need to look after our workforce as well and make sure that they can continue to keep doing the great work they're doing on the coalface. But it's difficult out there. It's pretty bleak. It's hard to give hope to the workforce for them to then give it to women at this point.
Something that we want to do with this inquiry is obviously hear stories about the impacts of the cost of living crisis, but ultimately refine a list of suggestions and recommendations on how we could make the situation better. Do you have any views about any policy issues that governments and policymakers should be considering as a matter of priority?
I think that's a really good question there. I think that given the dynamic situation we're working in on the front line, I think it's important that we're able to talk to government departments around the increase of demand. And there's ways where we can get access to funding to increase our worker hours when needed, particularly through times like we're experiencing at the moment. I think we've got some great support there for EAP services for our workforce, but making sure there's access to training, professional training during these times so we can support them and their own mental health. I think another point which is probably worth making here, a lot of people who are working in community services are often, they're also being impacted by the cost of living increase, right? So they're dealing with clients who have this trauma and this risk of homelessness or falling further into poverty and then going home themselves and having to try and survive through this period. So I think recognition of that, but with government, I think an ability to be able to talk to government about demand and seek support or at least one-off grants so we can increase our hours of workforce and respond appropriately to that and not lose the quality of service delivery what's required as well.
Thank you so much for your testimony today. Are there any closing remarks that you want to make?
No, just it's been great to be here. Thank you. Yeah, that's it.
No problem. Thank you, Kellyanne, CEO of the Zara Foundation. We will be back in about 15 minutes' time with our next guest. Welcome back to the inquiry into price gouging and pricing practices. We are now joined by our next guest, Grace, who's appearing as a private citizen and community member. Grace, thanks for joining us. Please take your time to make any opening remarks that you'd like.
No worries. Well, I'm a person that's in the, I guess you might say, in the middle class, and I have hunted around for good electricity deals. I put a solar system in 2008, which was pretty modest and took a big loan because that was ahead of the adoption curve. And that cut my bills by a third, but I'm constrained to be able to expand it because the way my roof is set up. Anyway, so there's been a bit of wheeling and dealing every year when I look at my electricity contracts. And I was quite pleased in June to be offered something that seemed quite reasonable, following on with my service provider. But out of the blue, on August the 17th, I got this email. I was sitting on my couch after a day at work, and it bowled me over. It talked about lifting my annual electricity bills by $550 odd, or about 25%, and giving me 2 weeks' notice that this would happen. I sat there shocked, realised a lot of this is going on, maybe. My first inclination was to hunt the house to see if I could find, what do you call them, beta blockers to calm myself down. And then I regrouped and thought, actually, this might just be a scam. It's got the sense of urgency, all the things they warn you about in a scam, the fear of a big price rise. I mean, something like 25%, I did a mental calculation, was pretty big. It had links in it. So then I guess over the next 2 days or 3 days, I hopped on, it was from Energy Australia. I hopped onto their website and I rang their number with no response. And I thought, I looked at scam alerts to see if this was a scam. And their advice on their website with scams was you only get emails from a certain address. When I looked at that address, that was not the address. It's got my customer number on it, but we've had a lot of data hacks. So was it genuine? So I was very keen. And then the only method I had to engage with them was to send a sort of alert, I think through their scam email, scam advice email, and also to chat online. I got a standard response from their scam email alert that said, what did it say? It said they were investigating it, but they never got back. Unfortunately, it's turned out to be true. It's not a scam. It has the hallmarks of a scam, looks like a scam, quacks like a scam. It's got the links, but it's true because my bill came through and it's not a 25% rise, it's a 29% rise on my tariffs. I've done the calculations. I have been shopping around to see if there's anything better, but unfortunately, it's all par for the course at the moment. Yeah, so it's a very simple story, but in these days when we've got huge data breaches and data hacks, you don't know what's coming at you. There's a scale of the price rise that was quite took my breath away.
I guess that does say something about how unbelievable you obviously thought the rate of the increase was.
Yeah.
Has this resulted in you having to change any of your behaviour or change the way you use energy at home?
Well, we've had some pretty cold weather, overcast in Adelaide lately, and I'm not turning on the control load because that was a massive increase, the control load from something like 17% overnight heating to 17 cents, to 29 cents. That's almost double. It's 27 cents, almost double. So the showers are tepid. It just means, I mean, I had my son's birthday the other night. It was very modest. Looking ahead, I scheduled out a dentist visit another 6 weeks. You know, just things like that. We've done everything we can, putting on the dishwasher once every 3 days. I was less money in the super, paying off the house at a slower rate. It's all a knock-on effect. Somebody else has got your money. Yeah. But that's all my story is, and it's very short and simple. But how are we to know, you know, and when their websites says what their genuine emails are and what the other ones, how are you to know? You know, anybody could grab your customer number these days. They have taken down that advice about what their genuine emails were when I last looked, because before coming here. So they must have cleaned that up a bit. But all my, I've hopped on that website 3 times and filled in their little online chat, asked them if it was a scam, asked them about the deal. Nobody's gotten back to me. I've written 3rd time lucky, please. So the customer service is pretty bad. It's not my only experience. Last year when I renewed my contract, you really have to watch, because these days they send a lot of things, look at this link and then agree to that, which I did. But when I got my bill, they'd taken out my cheap overnight heating, and that had upped my bill massively. I raised a flag that wasn't the agreement, and it turned out there had been a big mistake that maybe affected 1,000 customers, and I was given the money back. But only, I think I was lucky because I managed to download the file. When I went to go back when the bill came in and try and find it, the links had broken. So it just is a warning when you're signing these contracts and they chuff you off to other places, to make sure you've actually got some sort of PDF or record. But it took quite a bit of chasing, and it turned out the rascals had taken out the control load back quite a few months of the deal, so it was a massive increase. Right. But I did get my money back. Yeah, but it's not great customer service.
No, and you bore the responsibility for chasing it down.
Yeah, and it's taking time. So thank you for having this. I hope you've had a lot of feedback, and I just think consumers, we have to be incredibly vigilant. Yeah, have your head screwed on and your wits about you.
Indeed. I want to say thank you for your courage in coming and sharing your story. It's not an easy thing, but the purpose of this inquiry is to hear people's first-hand experiences and how the practices of large corporations and price gouging and unfair practices are actually impacting people, so that we can look at recommendations about how policy could be better set in this space. Just before you go, have you turned your mind to any ways that either government or policymakers could make changes to deal with some of these things that you've experienced?
Well, I just think, I think the Energy Made Easy website's a big help to people. I had a look last night. I think being on the case with the customer service and having genuine opportunities, when you're working the hours available to call centres and things, the staff aren't there, the phones ring out. Yes, if they do a big thing of putting up a big price rise, the phone's going to be busy for quite a while. Things just don't seem to be serviced to help. Ultimately, I think if the prices, you know, we know there's a war overseas and everything. If the retailers get better deals, they need to pass them back on to the consumers as quickly as possible and not delay, not be laggards. Get on with it and try and, you know, that's massive price rise we've had, but try and get back and restore some sense of sanity.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, thank you so much.
Thank
for
you,
coming
Dale.
in, Grace. We will leave it there. We've got our next guest coming up shortly. Thank you, Grace.